بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another in our series on Islamic finance, and we're discussing contracts that are used in Islamic finance and the overall rubric under which all of these contracts fall is bay'. Allah said, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Allah has made sales lawful, and He has prohibited riba. And so one of the kinds of sales is a sale of corpus, meaning things, and another major kind of sale is a sale of usufruct, and that is called in Arabic ijara. In English we call it a lease. Now, leases can involve the leasing of labor, human labor services, so that's called a labor lease. And a labor lease can be of two types. If somebody gets a job with a company, then they're called ajir khas. That means that during those working hours, their services are exclusively the right of their employer. There's another kind of labor lease where the person offering his services is offering them to the public in general. So that's called ajir am or ajir mushtarak, a general offering of labor or combined offering of labor, where that person is accepting people's requests for his services, and he's accepting requests from the general public. So for instance, a tailor, if somebody brings cloth to a tailor and says, make me a garment, so he can accept numerous requests from numerous people. He's not confined to one person. So that's a labor lease. The other kind of lease is the leasing of things, and so renting a house, leasing a ship or an airplane, renting an automobile. These are all examples of renting things. And so the person who is making a payment in that kind of ijara, he is purchasing the usufruct. He becomes the owner of the usufruct. And this is an interesting, I was so surprised when I heard this from one of my teachers. The default ruling in the Sharia is that the person who purchases usufruct becomes its owner, and he has the right to sell it to a third party if he chooses. And the owner of the actual source of the usufruct would have to make a special stipulation in the contract in order to prevent that. So the default ruling is that the owner of usufruct has a right to sublet it. Now, the particular topic that we're going to look at today is what's called a forward lease. And this is different from a normal operating lease in the sense that in a normal lease, a person, let's say they want to rent a car. So they come to the rental agency and they say, I want a four-door Toyota. And they bring a four-door Toyota around, and he looks at it and he says, okay, this one's good. And then they sign the contract. So the contract is being signed for a particular vehicle. The person has seen it. That's the vehicle he's renting. Now, in a standard lease of that type, the standard ruling in classical fiqh is that if for some reason that car is damaged, the contract is dissolved because the subject matter of the contract was that particular car. And when that particular car can no longer provide the benefit that the renter was seeking, then the contract cannot continue. Now there's another kind of lease called al-ijara al-mawsufatu fi dhimma. And what that means is that when the person is seeking, let's say, again, we'll talk about a car, he comes in, he says, I want a car that is four-door Toyota. And normally the way this kind of lease is structured is that the delivery will be at some time in the future. And so the car leasor says, okay, I can get you that kind of car and such a day. So this is very similar to a salam sale, but it's a salam sale of usufruct rather than of a corpus. Now we talked about salam sales earlier in a previous episode. It means that there's a buyer and a seller, and the buyer pays up front, and they agree that on a given day in the future, the seller will deliver such and such a good, 1,000 tons of this kind of wheat, and meeting certain specifications that it will be delivered on a specific date. So a forward lease is similar to a salam sale in that delivery is in the future and it is of a generic good. It's not valid to have a forward lease on a specific source of the usufruct. So you can't say, I want you to rent me that car in a month. So the question arises, well, why would you bother to make this arrangement so far in advance? There are certain reasons for it, and even in the classical era, there were situations where this came up, and this was an issue that was discussed in huge detail in the books of fiqh. Now, there is a certain amount of disagreement about the legality of a forward lease, and there's a certain angle of why it's reasonable to make a distinction between a salam sale of a tangible good, tangible asset, and this kind of a sale of usufruct. Because the nature of a sale is that when you take the item that you're buying, you get everything all at once. You get the thing and you get the usufruct, and it's all instantaneous transfer. But when you're renting something, your use of the usufruct is gradual. It comes over time. And so that's intrinsic difference between purchasing usufruct and purchasing a thing itself. And so for payment to be delayed, there's a ground to stand on for allowing that. Now, that is particularly relevant to Islamic finance because it's all based on the idea that somebody needs a service now, but they don't necessarily have the money to pay for it now. So, for instance, medical service or plane tickets or something like that. We're going to take a break and we'll be back in a minute, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're discussing forward leases and why they're being used in the Islamic finance industry today. Now, we were starting to talk about some of the uses of forward leases. Somebody comes to a bank, for instance, a person needs a certain kind of medical treatment and they can't afford it all at once. So what the bank agrees to do is arrange for the provision of this service to the customer. And they agree upon an institution that will provide the service. Now, when we talked earlier about the difference between particular ijara and forward ijara, we said that it's not allowed in forward ijara to specify the source of the usufruct. So you can't say, I'm going to rent you this car after a month for forward ijara. what you can say is, I will rent you services of a vehicle that meets such and such specifications. This issue came up as banks were starting to think about how they could provide these kinds of services. If you specify the service provider, the institution that provides the service, does that now turn this into particularized ijara? And the dominant ruling that has been delivered by Sharia boards on this issue is that what's prohibited there would make it no longer forward ijara, is if one were to specify, okay, that particular doctor is going to provide you this service. But if the institution that provides the service has many different doctors and the service that will be provided is made specific, but the particular individual that will be providing it is not, then that qualifies as forward ijara. So what happens in forward ijara is that there are two separate contracts. The bank signs a contract with the customer to provide a certain service. Now, the bank in an ijara contract, and in forward ijara contract in particular, the bank is not necessarily required to itself provide the service. It can subcontract. And so once this contract is signed, the nature of an ijara contract is that it's binding. So then once the bank has that contract in place, then it can go to the hospital and work out a second ijara contract where the bank purchases this medical service, and all of the costs, the subsidiary attendant costs that accompany that service, such as the medicines involved, they can also come into this contract. This refers back, or this principle is based upon a principle that we discussed in our series on Islamic legal maxims, at-tabi'u tabi'un, that the auxiliary to something in fact is auxiliary to it also in ruling. So the basic service that's being provided, or the basic subject matter of this transaction, is the medical service. And the medicines that are also used in delivering that service, they follow as an auxiliary. So now the hospital has lined up the purchase of usufruct from the hospital. And it's not necessary, I mean, in these kind of situations, the objection is not warranted to say, well, you know, how can a bank, it's impossible to imagine that the bank would personally use the medical services that it is purchasing. But that's not a requirement. So it purchases the services and then it delivers them to the customer. And then the customer can pay over time for the service that he or she couldn't afford in a single lump sum payment. The bank now has become a facilitator between those who need services and those who provide them. And another example of where this would be used and where it has been used is in education. So education is expensive. You know, I remember seeing a bumper sticker, or you see this bumper sticker in America which said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. So yeah, education is expensive, but you know, it's something that's pretty important in being able to earn a decent living. So education is expensive and people need it, and most of the time they don't have all of the money that's required to pay for it. So the same thing happens. A customer comes to the bank and says, I want to go to college. And they agree upon an institution. And then what the bank does is it lines up a number of clients for that institution, and it goes to the institution and says, we want you to reserve X number of seats in this faculty. And if that is agreed to, then the bank would make spot payment for those services. And the bank would then make those services available to the customers. The customers attend the classes and they pay the bank for its having arranged and delivered services to them, even though the bank itself is not personally providing those services. Another example of its use is in tourism and travel. Could be the general tourism and travel. It's also used for Umrah packages, where the customer wants tickets to go to a certain location and housing, hotel rooms while they're there. The bank would purchase X number of seats on airplane and X number of rooms in a hotel for a certain number of days, and then it delivers them to the client. And another way that it's used is celebrations. This is famous that people don't have enough money usually. It's a financial burden to celebrate weddings. Now, part of that is the kind of wedding that people choose to celebrate. One of the negative features of our time is this sense that if I don't keep up with the Joneses, then I will be disgraced. My neighbor, he had a wedding in this kind of location and invited 2,000 people, so I have to do the same. People who are rich can have their wedding celebrations in a big hotel downtown. People who aren't rich, they can arrange some other thing. In Malaysia, I live in Malaysia, this is one of the things that you see all the time. When you're driving in a neighborhood, the streets are kind of windy. They're designed so that you can't really get where you want to go once you get off the main street, because the streets are short and they keep changing direction. If you're driving down one of those streets on a Saturday or a Sunday, you'll frequently see a tent that's up and it's basically blocking the street. When you see one of those, you have to turn around and go the other way, because people who aren't rich enough to rent out the really fancy banquet halls for the weddings, they arrange with a caterer, they have this tent, and they invite people to come for the reception. So the saying that you should stretch your legs according to the length of your sheet applies. But if a person, let's say a person doesn't even have the money for all of the expenses associated with that tent on the street, they could arrange for a forward ijara arrangement with a bank or any kind of entity that would choose to do it like that, where the bank would make the payment to the caterer and the tent leaser, and then the customer would pay for it over time. So these are some of the ways that forward ijara is used. Another that's mentioned is the use of ijara in communication, like buying airtime. I mean, it seems like that should be fairly cheap and nobody would need to go to a bank for that, but it's mentioned in some of the writings on it. Now, one of the things that is also possible with forward ijara is that in a previous episode we talked about there's operating leases where the renting is done just to get the usufruct of the thing, and another is where it ends in a transfer of ownership. So forward ijara can also be used in those kinds of deals that end in a transfer of ownership. But we've come to the end of our time, so that's it for today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wallahu a'lam.